Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart and I've just finished painting this young lady for my friend Danny, and I thought it'd be fun to record how I went about it. Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet. Lady Elisse Duchaard is a prophetess of the Duke of Bretonnia, and her rules can be found in the Kingdom of Bretonnia arcane journal. Her miniature remains a little bit elusive at times. I missed out on her first release, and funny enough, so did Danny, who I'm painting it for, which is a little bit amusing for those who know. Her miniature was revealed fairly early on, and along with the Bretonian Foot Knights, she was one of the most anticipated miniatures, definitely by myself. I was really excited to get my hands on her to paint, and if you look at that absolutely fantastic studio paint job, I'm definitely not going to be able to do anything like that standard, but I'm going to be taking the colour scheme as my cues, and that's definitely what Danny would like me to do. So here she is, fully painted and primed black, and you'll see my hands as well. I seem to have got quite a lot of black paint on them. I've kept her separate from her unicorn at this stage. Even though there's an awful lot of white going on in this miniature, I want to separate the types of white between what she's wearing and the skin of the unicorn, so they stand out a little bit from each other. White can be tough to paint, so I wanted to build up as many layers as I could through the airbrush. I'm using two thin coats here. We have Cold Corpse Grey, we have Wolf Grey, and we have Gravestone Blue, and then we have Trooper White, and I also have some White Star as well. That is, the grey is a triad from Two Thin Coats paints, and I'm just using the airbrush here to slowly build them up layer by layer. I cover all the black in the end. There might be a tiny bit in some of the recesses to add a little bit of shadow, but I'm really kind of working and start off from top down, building those layers up to keep them as smooth as possible. So I'm going for a cooler white on the unicorn. We'll see it different when we get to Elisse herself, but the cooler white means lots and lots of these greys, and that's why I've stuck with these colours. And you can see as I slowly start to build my way through the initial triad and then into the whites, that you get this really nice smooth finish doing it this way, and it's so much quicker as well than building up with a standard brush. As we move on to the lighter tones there, the magic starts to happen, and it does start to look like white. And if you keep the airbrush at the right angles, and this is a low PSI here, probably around 15, just being very, very gentle, just flicking the paint on really, and you're able to leave quite a lot of the grey into the recesses and into the shadows and things, and you get this really nice effect. As we move on to the whites, I'm using the Trooper White here, which is a slightly creamier tone, but when you put it over these greys, it still looks pretty bright and vibrant, and I was pretty happy with it. Now I thought that I would move on to the next white, onto the White Star, but I decided in the end to go for a slightly different colour. So I reached for my Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, which is probably the best white out there, at least through the airbrush. I actually prefer, I think, the Two Thin Coats paints to use the hairy brush if I'm trying to blend and feather out, but this is such a good white for a nice bold covering. It's in the name, I suppose. I'm just using this to really, really make the top highlights stand out. For Elisse, I wanted a different feel completely, and I went for some dark sand and Trooper White again. So I'm starting with the dark sand, which is a dark sand colour, funnily enough. It's got yellow tones, so it's a lot warmer. So rather than starting with the grey tones, I'm starting with a warmer tone. So we get this kind of warmer white, and it not only should give her a little bit more vibrance and make her stand out from her mystical, magical beast, and it also just means it's better for the overall paint job because you've got two different types of white, so she doesn't sort of blend in and look like it's all one thing. As we move on to those white layers, it's slightly different to the unicorn because we're not doing anywhere near the same number of layers. So we still have that warmer yellow tone showing through, but there's a little bit of the black showing through as well, almost sort of a off-white grayscale kind of effect. And that's what I wanted really. I wanted it to aid the shadow, but be so subtle that you couldn't really see the black and point it out. I don't know how well that shows up on camera there, but they are very, very subtly different whites, and I was pretty happy with it as it had gone so far. Now we're moving on to some Templar white with the express colour and some of their medium, and I've got it thinned on my wet palette. And this makes painting white so much easier. And this is obviously a bluey, grey kind of white. I'm using it all over the unicorn, so I'm using it on all the hair. Thin glaze over the top, but allowing it to run into those recesses. So it's not quite a wash, but it's doing the job of a wash a little bit, and it will just really, really nicely shade. But I also used it to go in between all of the areas of the musculature as well. You can see I'm just, again, just really, really thin, painting it in. It just reinforces those shadows. It's very, very subtle, but this is such an easier way of doing white rather than building up layer and layer with just white paints itself. So this is Iron Jaws Yellow and some contrast medium, and it's a very, very light mix. I've thinned it down loads and loads with the medium. If you look at the studio paint job, there's a kind of a yellowish tone, almost like a baby yellow kind of tone. I couldn't think of a better way of describing it, really. It's the kind of yellow you would find on a baby's jumper or something like that, but so light and subtle. And I just wanted to give it a very, very faint glaze over the whole area that wants to be that colour, which is the top half of her dress, and still showing some of the white through. And by doing this really thin glaze, those raised areas still show whiter, but you just get a little bit in the recesses. I didn't want to make it into a full wash and become messy. Really wanted to allow the work that I've done with the airbrushes, those subtle smooth layers, show through, so I didn't have to do loads of work afterwards. And by the same tone, this is deep purple, also with that contrast medium. I'm using the Citadel one, again this time very, very thin. And again, if you look at the studio paint job, the bottom sort of quarter of her dress has got this lovely pattern. There's fleur-de-lis, there's goblets, there's roses and flowers and things, but it looks like it's only just slightly pink. And when you thin this colour, it gives you almost the exact match of the colour in the studio paint job. And again, I'm just doing this very thin glaze, but allowing it to work a little bit more like a wash, going into those recesses, and it's just seems to have worked really, really well. Now, I use this colour an awful lot. This is Dwarf Skin, and I wanted to again make use of the white sort of underpaint here and just give a very thin coat of Dwarf Skin first, just as a bit of a base layer on all of her flesh, just as an outline to follow really. I'm going to be using normal flesh tones later on. And then mixing a little bit of Agarash Dunes with some medium, again on the wet palette here. I'm using a wet palette for these kind of paints, really sort of turns them into glazes and allows you to control them a lot better. And again, I'm just doing a very thin glaze over her hair, so she's got that kind of sandy, dusty blonde hair. Now, the Pegasus almost has this sort of flowery reef around its sort of chest area, and I'm using lizard green here, and I messed up the recording of this. You can just see me doing a little bit of this lizard green here, and it's gone. And then we're on to the Cygor brown, which I'm going to be using for the base, for the bark. So again, because we've base coated the miniature and worked up these layers of this nice greyish white colour, you can use contrast paints to base coat afterwards. I like base coating in contrast. I talk about it a lot of my videos. I think it's a really nice way of doing it. I will highlight them very traditionally, and afterwards you won't be able to tell that we're base coated with contrast, but because we've got this beautiful sort of light white base to paint on top of, this is just perfect. So sticking with those same techniques, this is Doomfire Magenta Contrast, and again thinning it heavily with contrast medium on my wet palette. You get this really kind of light pinkish effect when you paint it over the white, which funnily enough almost exactly matches the colour that's on the studio paint job, which is what I'm trying to copy in terms of colour scheme, not in terms of standard or quality. I'm doing my best here just to leave the centre blank and white so I can use a similar method again for the yellow centres. Returning to Dwarf Skin while I wait for those to dry, again mixing it with contrast medium here, and I'm just using it to slightly glaze and add a filter to the front of the unicorn's nose and around the eyes. So again, if you look at the studio paint job, there's a little flesh colour showing through, and you'll see that on white horses and things as well. And because I've thinned this so much, I can feather it out and you get that nice effect. And then we're on to contrast Basilicanium Grey, working the same way again, a little bit of contrast medium. And I'm just feathering it out, allowing it to then run into the recesses of the unicorn's horn. So I'm leaving it a little bit whiter at the top, letting it darker in on those recesses, and then going back with a clean brush just to take it off those flat surfaces. I'm also using the same mix just on the bottom of the hooves as well. Again, I was still waiting for those flowers to dry properly, so I just painted in the eyes with a little bit of black. And then we're on to Contrast Imperial Fist. Again, a little bit of medium. I'm just filling out the centre of those flowers in yellow. So now for some skin. So this is two thin coats: Triad, Barbarian Brawn, Dwarven Skin and Elven Skin. It's probably the most common triad of skin that I use from them at the moment. Really enjoying it. I do have two of their other skin triads, but this is the kind of most all-round and definitely the lightest of skin, and she definitely requires that. She's very, very pale, typical sort of blonde haired, blue-eyed woman, and I'm really just kind of building up from dark to light here, swapping between the colours. So this isn't a kind of standard paint job. I'm taking my time, messing around a little bit, and this isn't really a standard tutorial, so I'm not going to take you through all those stages bit by bit, because it was such a long paint job. I think in total I spent about 12 hours on this miniature, and that does make it quite a long tutorial. I will be doing some separate tutorials soon when I break down some of the recipes like skin into shorter videos, so do look out for those. But I'm kind of going with the darker colours, reinforcing the shadow areas here. So I'm just painting that Barbarian Brawn under the shadow underneath the sort of the collarbone there, in the nape of the neck, that kind of thing. Then I continue just to build up those layers, very, very thin coats here. I don't want too many visible kind of layer lines. If it was a rank and file miniature, I wouldn't mind that much at all, but I've thinned it enough, and I'm almost wet blending a little bit on the miniature and keeping those lines very, very thin, and just slowly building it up, going back, readjusting and playing around with it a bit. Now the Elven Skin is that top highlight, but I have gone back to the deep purple again, thinned quite a lot on the wet palette, and I'm just adding a little bit of warmth back here and there, adding a little bit of rosy tints to the underside of the cheeks a little bit, sort of glazing it in a little bit around her lips and things as well. I like to do the eyes in and around doing the skin, especially when I have some final highlights to go, just in case I mess up. But then we're back to the Agarash Dunes, and I'm adding a little bit of white to the mix. So that's the same colour I used for a glaze, and actually mixing it into paint for highlights. And you can do that with contrast paints. It works very well, rather than trying to find another paint to match it. If you can add a little bit of white, it works pretty well for it, especially when you've got a very pastel effect tone, which is really what I've got going on here with this miniature. Then I've reached for the Iandan Yellow here. I just again thinned it on the wet palette. I just decided to add a little bit of warmth and make her hair stand out a little bit. So I'm just reinforcing those shadows a little bit, just by adding a little bit in there, and it really enriches the hair, makes it a little bit more golden and stand out. At this stage I glued her onto the Pegasus. I covered most of the base areas I wanted. I wish I left her left hand off for painting her face, but other than that I was pretty happy. Now, if you're after some Bretonian themed dice, please check out the channel's sponsor, Baron of Dice. They have an absolutely fantastic range of dice that covers many, many, many different army needs. So do check out their website. There's a link in the video description below. And if you use Miniature Realms at the checkout, you get an extra 5% discount. Now, the only little bit of heraldry is this small shield that's dangling down from the sort of bottom of that flower wreath thing there. I used Blood Angels Red and Black Legion contrast paints to paint in the base colours. They are quartered, but this video is chronological, so we'll come back to those highlights a little later on. To highlight those green leaves, this is Goblinoid Green and Troll Snot Green, so that's a mid and a highlight tone in one of the Two Thin Coats triads. And again, gone a little bit out of focus here. I was very much concentrated on painting rather than making sure I was always in the perfect position to filming, and that's why this isn't so much of a standard tutorial and more of a journey about how I painted this miniature, but very much thin lines around the edges of the mid-tone, and then just finishing off with some very fine edge highlights. The miniature's got loads and loads of detail on it. It's very, very easy to pick those out. We have Hull Red, Saddle Brown and German Camo Pale Brown. My own little triad I like to make up, but it's perfect to highlight over the Cygor Brown contrast. And again, if you watch a lot of my tutorials, you'll have seen those mixes before. Again, I'm out of focus a little bit here. I'm just building those up layer by layer. being quite subtle, keeping those paints nice and thin so the layer lines aren't too stark, just focusing on where the light would hit and building them up slightly, and it looks perfect and it's super easy to do. To highlight the black on that little shield, we have Cold Quartz Blue, Wolf Grey and Gravestone Blue. And really simple here. I'm almost going around the edges of the quartered area, and it's quite squared off, so I'm using the edge of my brush on the edge of the black. Tiny little areas, very little to do, one colour after the other, focusing with the lighter colours just as little dots really. Then for the red areas, I'm using Sanguine Scarlet and Demon Red also from 2 thin coats. Same thing yet again really, just some thin edge highlights with little dots of the brightest touch. To highlight those flowers, I'm using that contrast Doomfire Magenta again and doing what I said earlier on, just adding a little bit of white in there, and it really just works with this method of this very pastel toned miniature. Just a tiny little highlights around the edge of those flowers just to really make them pop out. So rather than trying to find a light pink that matched, this is just the easiest way to do it, adding white into those contrast paints. And yes, much the same again, this is Imperial Fist with the same Trooper white, and we're going back in just with the tops and the centres of those little flowers. Again, out of focus, a little point there, apologies, but just little dots just to make them stand out. There's not a huge amount of metallic on the miniature, but we have black metal and heavy metal, which are some of the best miniature paint names around from the Scale, Colour Metal and Alchemy range. And we're just using the black metal first. Staff here at the side is metallic and has a bit of a glow. We'll cover that later on, but just painting those colours in and then adding the silver on top afterwards. I'm using heavy metal here, which is a fairly bright silver, but not quite as bright and overpowering as the Game Air silver, which I usually use in conjunction with the black metal. And that's really because I just want to be a lot more subtle and have smoother transitions on this paint job, it being a character, and it being the kind of miniature that it is. It feels like it shouldn't be too stark. I'm using the same colour mixes on her headdress as well. There's little bits of silver as well as gold, which we'll get onto later, but she also has a crisscross pattern across the top of her hair that's metallic as well, and again I'm using these same 2 silvers. Sticking with the Metal and Alchemy range from Scale Colour, I have Dwarven Gold and Elven Gold. I'm not starting too dark here. I want this to be, again, bright and vibrant and fit in with those pastel tones. So if I started with a deep bronze, which I often do for golds, it would look a little bit too dark, and I want this to really stand out. So painting in the fleur-de-lis here and the gold areas on the goblet and all around her sort of little waistband you see there. She's got gold jewels and things all over. So every now and then I take a little break from the detail stuff and do something else, and I'm using Basilicanian Grey and Wildwood here just to paint in some stuff on the base to prep it for later. It's a lot easier to do if I'm concentrating doing really sort of fine detail work, and this then will be dry later on when I'm ready to do the next stage of it, rather than getting to the end of the miniature and being really excited and having to wait for stuff to dry. So occasionally I will do this. I'll just stop halfway through and do a little bit of the base or something like that. So sticking with lots of contrast, as you see, Croxagore scales, and I'm using this just on the sort of magical ball there. Again, gone out a little bit of focus, but I really didn't have filming in mind enough with this, so my apologies. But you'll just see here, and it's much easier to see here, I'm also using it heavily thinned with medium on the wet palette to use it as a bit of object source lighting. So just glazing it over the side of the unicorn's hair here, where the glow from that magical globe at the end was just reflecting on the hair. And I'm also doing it on the side really subtly of her sleeve there. So you just want a slight blue glow, you don't want to completely cover it. And contrast paints and glazes like that, so easy way of doing it. Essentially I'm glazing here. Before contrast existed, we'd just be talking about glazes, but because it's contrast, I just think it's made it easier to do. In the centre of that ball, I just added a little bit of white to that Croxagore and just gave it a little bit of a highlight, which I glazed back afterwards. Now it's time to really go back to all those whites and give them their proper highlights. Remember, we've got the Trooper white and the White Star. The Trooper white's a much creamier colour. I've also gone back to that Templar white, which is the contrast style paint. And again, I'm just using it to reinforce some shadows on the kind of darker greyer blue white parts of her clothing. So it really stands out from the pinks and the yellow tones that are in there. But for most of her dress, I'm sticking with Trooper White, which is on my palette, thin just with water, very thin, really thin layers building up here. And I'm just working where the folds of the clothing are at their highest. You've already got that standing out quite well because of the way we glazed in those little yellow areas earlier on. I'm just very, very thinly building up layer after layer, and you won't see that really in this video because I don't show you for long enough. Just reinforcing that white and slowly layer by layer building it up. I don't want really stark highlight lines. You can maybe see that a little bit easier around the back here as I just focus the whitest area towards the top of that fold, allowing that sort of darker, creamier lemon yellow in those recesses, but I really want it to be a smooth transition. I'm sticking with the same Trooper white here for all that beautiful pattern that's on the bottom of the dress. I'm being very careful here because I really like the effect of it as it was with just the glaze over the top. But I'm just going back where the light would hit the most. And again, very, very thin layers of paint. You don't want it to look messy. You don't want to see the brush strokes too much. And just sort of filling those areas back in, maybe along the bottom of the dress a little bit as well, just to reinforce that sort of bottom seam to make it stand out. Once we get onto the Pegasus, we're onto the white star, so that slightly brighter, cleaner white, that more pure white rather than the creamier tones. And again, that's deliberate, so we have that different effect between the two different styles of whites and creams that she's wearing and what the unicorn has itself. Again, same technique, super thin layers of paint, reinforcing towards those top areas and blending and smoothing out, not going too far so that we end up with this pure white. We want that grey showing there, but we want it to be so subtle so you get this nice smooth transition. It's a little bit easier in some ways when you get to the bottom with the hair, because you can aim just for the top of these strands of hair. Obviously if you mess it up, which I did a few times and gone a bit too thick, I just glazed it back down again with that Templar white express colour paint and then redid it. But again, I'm trying to leave it a little bit darker and a little bit greyer in the hair, but I still want to pick those top layers out, and it really starts to pop and looks quite nice. And then before we knew it, I was nearly done. So this is a Vallejo Deer Armour FX. This is dark earth. This is a sort of sand and paint mixture, the same as your Stirling Mud types things from Games Workshop. If you haven't come across them before, they're about 12, 13, maybe £14 now for a tub, but it's a big tub and probably lasts you 10 times as long as a little pot of Stirling Mud does. This is actually a game from the same Deer Armour FX range, but this is European mud, thick mud. Thick mud rather than earth texture is more of an effect paint, while you could cover the whole base with it. The way it works is much better. You apply it thick, it looks wet, a little bit looks dry. It's really cool. I think this was Creed camo, but it might be Minotaur and green contrast paint. And again, I'm just glazing it in to the edges of the rocks, blending it out around the bit of rubbing here as well. Just looks a little bit like weathering or verdigris or something like that. And this is some oil wash. This is ready mixed grease from Soilworks. You'll have seen it a lot in my videos. It's quite a sepia tone, quite light. Again, I'm just splodging it on really around the sand texture and then into the recesses on all the ruins. When it dries, because it's an oil paint, it will look very matte and dry and dusty, which is a really nice effect. Once that was fully dried, brushed in some dry pigment, and I can't even remember which colour I used here, but I think this is called something green, but it's almost a whitish colour. Just really goes into those recesses and makes it look like a dusty dry stone. And then this is sort of a browner ochre colour, and again just running that into the sort of soil areas, just in patches, not all over, and it just gives the ground a bit more variation and a realistic texture. And I started adding lots and lots of 2mm tufts and some flowers as well, or just one little patch of flowers. I think that really offsets her really nicely, makes her sort of stand out or links her to the ground, and then a few leaves and things as well. Before a final sort of bout of just adding a little bit more of that mud back in. Once the tufts are on there, they can look like they're stuck on top a little bit. If you add a little bit of mud around them and on top of them, it blends them in with the rest of the base. And then with a little bit of water added at times as well, just put a little bit of mud around the hooves and around the legs of the unicorn as well. I think at this stage it was pretty much done. I might have gone back and added a few little touch-ups here and there. You can see a little bit more mud and splatter I added up around the back of the tail and the underside of the unicorn. I really wanted her to look graceful and beautiful, and it too as well, but also the realism of it being in that muddy field in battle. And that was her done. I hope you enjoyed the video. I had loads and loads of fun painting her. Not quite the usual painting tutorial in terms of full depth at each stage, but it was such a big painting project in terms of technique and things like that. It would be too big and too long to really break it down to its full detail. Anyway, let's have a look at some proper photographs of her. Photographing white can be a little bit of a nightmare. To remove the background here, and these are just photos taken on my iPhone, which I always do. Some proper lighting, but I'm definitely not a professional photographer. But I'm really happy with the way it's come out. I was a little bit concerned because I couldn't spend the amount of time that the miniature deserves in some ways. I rarely do. I paint miniatures for gaming most of the time. I did want to make this a higher level, so this is definitely something you'd have leading your army, and I wanted to do a really nice job for my friend as well. But I couldn't spend the time I felt the miniature was due, which would be the kind of a whole week painting it sort of competition standard. I just don't have time to do that anymore. The miniature definitely deserves that, and I've seen other people who have painted to that standard, and I'm not surprising at all because it's an absolutely stunning miniature. But I did feel that using the techniques that I did, I was able to get a fairly high-end finish while cutting a few corners here and there, which was my main goal. I wanted to have a really nice, striking miniature that would draw the eye. But when you look a little bit closer, you can obviously see that some areas could be more refined. But I managed to get a lot of the techniques that I use for standard army painting, but refine them a little bit more and take a lot more time over them. And using the airbrush was just a lifesaver with that white, along with things like Templar white, the express colour. It's just painting white has got so much easier. And I was really pleased with the way it worked with the yellow tones on her dress and those pink tones. It just came out really well and did everything I wanted it to. Anyway, let me know what you think. And if you're still here at this stage of the video, thank you very much. If you'd like to support the channel, giving this video a like, dropping a comment below really helps the video get seen by others. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. There's loads of other painting videos, more traditional tutorials, lots of discussion around the games I'm interested in, the games I play, huge amounts of Warhammer the Old World, and there'll be lots more, but I cover loads and loads of things. And if you have a quick scoot around the channel, you will see all of those. I have a very friendly Discord, or the channel has a very friendly Discord. If you'd like to join that, there's a link in the video description below. And if you'd like to support me even further, I do have a Patreon, and again, link in the video description below. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.